Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and I am back today because I mentioned in my recent Sennheiser HD600 review video that I wanted to do a more in-depth comparison of that HD600 with its closely related sibling, the Massdrop plus Sennheiser HD6XX headphone. And I figured, hey, while I'm at it, why not give some more thoughts about where those two fit in with some other models in Sennheiser's line, such as the other collaboration with Massdrop at the lower end of the price scale, and that is the HD58X Jubilee. Then I have also reviewed in the past the HD660 S, which was a written review, and so I will put a link to that down in the description. And I have reviewed in video form the original HD800 and the HD800 S. So, where do all of those fit in together relative to each other? What do they tell us about what Sennheiser's goals are as a company and what they're going for in their house sound? And where do each of these fit into the market at large and that sort of thing? So let's explore those questions here in this video today. So, as usual, please remember to like and subscribe and to do all of those things that you do to support YouTube channels. And with that, we will jump back into it. Okay, so let's just start with kind of the 1,000-foot view of the models that I just mentioned there, the 6 Sennheisers that I have been able to review. And they are, again, the HD800 S, the HD800, the HD600 6XX, which is essentially an HD650. Okay, they are basically the same headphone, right? And the HD660 S and the HD58X Jubilee. Now, this is not the entirety of Sennheiser's line. These are all open back models, and they have a few other open backs like the HD700, which I haven't really ever heard anyone mention the HD700 for like a few years now. And then they have some other open backs at the lower end of the price range, like the HD598 and 599 and those sorts of things, which I have not yet heard. So this isn't exhaustive, but I think that the 6 models that I have reviewed gives a fairly good cross-section of what Sennheiser is all about, at least on the open back side of things. So, things that they have in common. So, most of them, the exceptions would be the 58X Jubilee and the 660 S. Okay, most of them have a 300 ohm impedance. And that is not super common beyond Sennheiser or Beyerdynamic anymore. ZMF is about the only company that I can name right now where like most of their line is high impedance, like in that 300 ohm or higher range. Like I know AKG has a 600 ohm model or two, a 600 ohm model or two, and Audio-Technica, I think it's the R70X, has a 600 ohm model as well, but really it's Sennheiser and Beyerdynamic and a little bit of ZMF being in the high impedance dynamic driver headphone space right now. So what that does is a couple of things. For one thing, you hear that Sennheisers have a reputation for sounding great on vacuum tube amplifiers, and they do. Like, that reputation is well deserved. And part of it is because of that 300 ohm impedance. Okay. Now, even the 58X and the 660 S, those are 150 ohm models, which is still high enough that they end up working okay with a lot of the cheaper tube amps that are output transformer-less, or OTLs. Okay. So that's one thing that you can do with the Sennheiser line that is not as easy to do with other headphone makers. Like Focals, for example, are all low impedance dynamics, and they don't work so great on tube amps, in my opinion, particularly OTLs. Anything will work fine on a tube amp if you spend enough on a tube amp to get a nice transformer to make it more compatible with low impedance loads. But in the space where you're spending an appropriate amount of money for these things, that 300 ohm impedance is nice because of that. Okay, and the 150 ohm impedance works, just not quite as well as the 300 ohm there. So the two models here, the 6XX and the 600, are arguably the two that changed the most in the Sennheiser line, going from a solid state amp to a tube amp. And I explained why in my HD600 review, which I will just briefly talk about again, is that they have a U-shaped impedance curve where the impedance it bottoms out really. Like 300 ohms is the low value, and that happens around 1 kilohertz. You get to lower frequencies, you get closer to the resonant frequency of the driver. That drives up the impedance because the driver becomes harder to control. You get to higher frequencies. A dynamic driver voice coil is essentially just an inductor, and inductors do inductor things as frequency increases, and so the impedance gets higher and higher as you increase in frequency. So you get this U-shaped impedance graph going on, and tube amps in particular, but some solid state amps that you pay for the privilege to do so, they naturally deliver more voltage, which is what dynamic drivers need, okay, as impedance goes up. And so that's why these two in particular tend to transform when you go from solid state to tube amps, at least as you hear, and they can sound like two very different headphones as a result. And that's because they are getting more power that they need from those tube amps. And again, you can do it with solid state. You just have to pay for it a little bit more, usually. Okay, so that's what's going on there. Now, I will quickly make some comments about like where these things fit in. All these models fit in along the Sennheiser line, and then like in the market space in general. So to me, the 58X and the 660 S, these are the two 150 ohm models, have a more consumer-oriented tuning, where in their stock form they have a little bit more bass and treble presence. Not necessarily a V-shape. I would still say they are more neutral than they aren't, but they have a little bit more bass presence and treble presence than the stock tunings of particularly the 600 and the 6XX/650. Right? And so if you are new to the hobby, or you have a friend who you want to get into the hobby, the 58X and 660 S tunings are a good place to start because they are going to sound the most familiar to someone who's been listening to more mass market stuff like Beats or the Bose and Sony active noise cancelers. Active noise cancelers, excuse me. Okay, or even the Apple, what are they? The AirPods Max or something. They're full size active noise cancelers too. Like, these are going to sound closer in tuning to those. They are not going to be quite as thunderous or as thick in the bass as many of those, particularly like the Sony ANCs. Okay, but they're going to have a more familiar-ish tuning, but still be more resolving, more detailed, and just overall like have better timbre, sound more natural, and all of that than those mass market brands. So I think that's the real strength of the 58X and the 660 S. Is their ability to do that. Is like they sound great. They have a little bit wider appeal in their tuning, so they are good at getting people into the hobby. I have found, just talking to audiophile friends and all of that, that they tend to, once they get into the hobby, move on from the 58X and the 660 S somewhat quickly. The two of them, the 58X and the 660 S, are, again, they sound very similar. The 660 S has a little bit more technical refinement to it. It's a little bit more resolving, handle spatial reproduction a little bit better, and that sort of thing. So like they are very closely related in terms of their overall sound, but the 660 S is just the one that's just a little bit better, more technically proficient. Now, I think in the headphone market more broadly speaking, the 58X was for a while, I think, really the smart entry point for a lot of new people getting into the hobby. I think it has been caught in terms of its price to performance ratio by something like the Hi-Fi-Man HD600 SE, which now sells for $109, and is just overall higher performing than this. Now, the HD400 SE requires a dedicated amplifier where this does not necessarily, but it still sounds better in price to performance ratio. So I think it's been caught there. I think this has been caught there as a result. The 660 S has never really struck me as a strong price to performance contender. And you can see my written review for where I fully flesh out why that is. But those are my thoughts there. Like, if you can pick up a used 660 S for, you know, in the $250, $275 range, I think that's a pretty good place for it. But at the full list price of, I think, $499 for that one, I just think that's too much. All right. Let's jump over these and come back to them in a moment, okay? And let's talk about the HD800 and the HD800 S. Now, the HD800 here in the summer, at least in the northern hemisphere, so in mid-July 2022, the HD800, the original, is just getting harder and harder to find. You really can only buy it used anymore. If you can find one, what Sennheiser did with the HD800 line is they took the criticisms that these two, the 600 and the 650/6XX, were a little too intimate in the soundstage, and they said, oh yeah, watch this, and they just really widened the soundstage out, and they also gave it some pretty good imaging and separation. So it does really nice, wide, big, speaker-like in the lateral dimension spatial presentation. Okay, and of course also really upped the resolution capability of that headphone from the 600 or the 650/6XX. The 800 S came along and took all of those qualities and just refined them a little bit more. And also the HD800 was known for having just a little bit too much bite, around 2 to 2.5 kilohertz in its frequency response. And so the 800 S smoothed that out a little bit. Did not cure it completely, but smoothed it out a little bit. Upped the resolution capability just a little bit more and tightened that spatial presentation just a little bit more too. Right, so, and then they changed the overall design. Like you've noticed, all of these that I've held up looked pretty much like this, but the 800 and the 800 S have a fundamentally different physical design to them too, and they are light but very comfortable. Okay, and that's one thing to mention, is that all of these, when they first come in, all of them put your head in a vice. Like, they clamp hard. And so I like to just find a bookshelf speaker or something like this, sit them on there overnight for a couple of nights, and they generally loosen up fairly well. But right out of the box, they can really put the squeeze on your head, so just be aware of that. But anyway, back to the HD800s. So in the HD800 and the HD800 S's, they specifically address the spatial presentation weaknesses or criticisms of the HD600 and the 6XX, and just say, watch this, give you this big sound stage, they up the resolution, and so forth. And they still have pretty good timbre too. Okay, their timbre does not stand out as being amazing for the price, in my opinion, as it does for these guys, but outside of that little bit of a peak and a little bit of a bite for the HD800, around 2 to 2.5 kilohertz, and not quite as bad, but still not zero for the HD800 S, their timbre and their tuning are really good. Now, it is true of all of the Sennheisers, even these two, that if you're a bass head, move on. They don't have particularly great bass extension. They have a reasonable amount of punch and physicality in the mid bass, so like in the 100 to 150, maybe up to 200 hertz region. They will give you a nice satisfying little hit, like on kick drums and that sort of thing, but there's not a whole lot of weight or thump or slam to come with it that comes from the sub bass hitting you very, very hard, because there just isn't a ton of sub bass. They all fairly aggressively roll off. Even the expensive ones, the 800 S, which is like $1,700 USD and MSRP right now, like that rolls off a fair amount in the bass. So that's just something that's true of all Sennheisers. You don't get into them because you love lots of bass presence and extension and low sub-bass rumble. All right. Now let's talk about these two. Get into these two a little bit. And I might repeat some things from my HD600 video, but that's okay. Now, neither of these are, again, they're not particularly bassy, and they don't have particularly great treble extension either. Okay, that was another thing I needed to say about the 800 and 800 S, is they have good treble extension and good airiness, where these don't. Okay, these have a nice treble presence, like cymbals and all of that still sound really good, but there's just not a ton of air beyond that. Okay, so they roll off in the bass, in the sub bass in particular. They roll off in the really high upper treble, but in between those roll off points, even with a tube amp, okay, they are pictures of neutrality in their frequency response between those roll off points, especially the 600. The 650/6XX introduces just a little bit more energy in the warmth region, which is like the lower to mid hundreds of hertz in the frequency response. And so there's just a little bit more mid-bass presence and a little bit more warmth here, which is why the 650 and the 6XX have a reputation for being a warm sounding headphone. I would call their tuning neutral warm. Whereas the 600 is quite neutral because it does not have as much warmth there. But it's also a bit mid-centric because the lack of really deep sub-bass or high-frequency air really sets the attention in between those areas in the mid-ranges, in the mid-range frequencies and such, and lower treble and that sort of thing. Okay, so that's the, like, they have slightly different tunings to them. The 600 is more true neutral. The 650/6XX is a neutral leaning warm. All right. Now, you get to about somewhere in the 1 to 2 kilohertz range, on all the way up until their maximum treble extensions. They sound pretty much identical, right, from that point on. Like, from a tuning perspective, you just notice that the 6XX/650 has a little bit more warmth. Now, the added warmth of the 6XX does come with some other presentation consequences, I think. Neither of these headphones are soundstage monsters, and neither of them are particularly good at imaging and separation. So again, imaging is placing a sound somewhere in the sound field, and then separation is being able to put space between those sonic images. Side note, if you want really good imaging and separation for around the price of the 6XX or so, get a Beyerdynamic DT880 600 ohm. That's one of its real strengths, okay? Just hold that up there to show you that that's what you should go for if that's what you really want at this price range. Okay. Both of these, in terms of spatial presentation, then are going to give you what you hear like as the 3 blob spatial presentation. There's information center, there's information left, this is my left, your right, and then there's information right. Okay, not a ton in between those. So left, center, left, right, a little bit of a hole, all that. Now, I think there are also a little bit of differences here. The added warmth of the 6XXs, to me, closes in the soundstage just a little bit more than is on the HD600. So vocals come out of the sound field just a little bit more, I think, particularly in the low vocals, a little bit more apnea, okay, and just they sound a little, and everything sounds just a hair closer. It's just a little bit, okay, under 1 kilohertz or so, and I think that's because of the more tuning. Now, if you've heard the expression Sennheiser veil, I think that is what's responsible for it here with the 650/6XX, is that slightly added warmth can be interpreted by some as a little bit less resolution, a little bit less clarity and a little bit more muddiness or veiled, like a little bit something is missing. You listen to these for any length of time and that feeling fades. For me, it fades rather quickly. And then you realize there is actually a lot of mid-range and lower mid-range resolution on this. Also this, okay? It's there, it's just the tuning can make it appear at first to be just a little bit more muddy than it actually is. Because the 600 is a little bit more true neutral in its tuning, I think it sounds initially a little bit cleaner. Okay, particularly through the lower to mid hundreds in frequency. Okay, so 100 hertz to 600 hertz, somewhere in that range. It just sounds a little bit cleaner, which I think some people are going to interpret as it being having a little bit more clarity, being a little clearer, being less muddy. Now, it also, to me, also means that it doesn't sound as closed in, like kind of in these temple areas here. So it's pulled back just a little bit, okay, giving me like not quite as closed in a sound. I do not find the soundstage on either of these claustrophobic, but I have heard some people who love large soundstage describe them that way. They both have a more intimate presentation as a result. I think the 6XX sounds a little bit more closed in, so it is more spatially intimate, but because of the slightly different presentation and like the slight, and I mean slight, perception of increased vocal clarity on the 600, that it's a bit more like sonically intimate or emotionally intimate. It's hard to describe. Okay, vocals can still sound just a little bit more intimate because of this like slight added perception of clarity. Okay, but here's the thing on everything else. These two are pretty much dead even in terms of overall resolution capabilities. From their lowest ranges that they reach down to in the bass to the highest that they reach up to in the treble. Okay, they are almost dead even in terms of what they can resolve and pull out of the signal. Other than that slight, to me, the 6XX feeling a little bit spatially closer, other than that, they are essentially dead even on their ability to throw a soundstage and to place sonic images in the soundstage, in the sound field, and then put space between them. Neither one really beats the other noticeably to my ear in terms of how deep they can reach down into the bass or how high they can reach up into the treble. Their frequency extensions seem to be about dead even. Again, the only real difference being 6XX having a slight bit more emphasis from about 100 to 500 to 600-ish hertz, which gives it just a little bit more sense of warmth. Okay? So that's really the difference between the two. It's just that little bit of warmth. Otherwise, and then that having just a slight consequence on on the soundstage. And I do mean it's slight. Like, you've got to listen for it to know that it's there. So, other than that, they're pretty much dead even across the board. They are sibling models. They sound like it. Right? They really do. So, I think that if your primary listening is like more intimate acoustic music, that doesn't even need a whole lot of mid-bass. So if you're into string quartets, if you're into choral music, if you're into smaller, smoother jazz, let's see, what else might be in there? Some folk rock, that sort of thing. I think the HD600 is, because of just the tuning difference, is the better match for those kinds of genres. If you are into classic rock, heavy metal, blues, bluegrass, genres with a little bit more energy to them and where a little bit more bass presence and warmth is necessary for the experience, or is intended to be part of the experience. Like, for example, heavy metal. One of the points of heavy metal is that the bass comes up a little bit more, giving that sense of a heavy, thick sound. It's just how it is. The 6XX is a better tuning match for heavy metal, for classic rock, blues and that sort of thing, okay, because of that added warmth. So if those are your preferences, I would go with the 6XX. If you like big, bombastic, classical music, like Beethoven's Fifth, or the 1812 Overture, or you like big pipe organ music, or you're into Hans Zimmer, don't buy a Sennheiser, buy the Beyerdynamic DT880, because it will be better for those, okay? But these two, the reason they are still around, and like the 600 was released, I don't know, early mid 1990s, something like that, and then the 650, which became, the 6XX and all of that was released just a few short years later. They have remained mostly unchanged since they were released now, close to a generation ago. And the reason they haven't changed much is because they haven't needed to. Like Sennheiser, they really killed it on that. And there still are not other headphones that I know of that do what the 600 does, or do what the 650/6XX does, really out there that I can think of. Like, they really are unique beasts in their own right that still fill a unique niche that others are still trying to replicate. And what they do with that niche that's just really spectacular is just how amazing their mid-range is. Their mid-range timbre just being a sonic trait that like makes the thing sound like the real thing, okay? When you say, the reason that a guitar sounds like a guitar is because of timbre. And I don't just mean from audio reproduction, I mean in real life. What distinguishes one human voice from another human voice is the timbre and all of that. Mid-range timbre reproduction on these two is excellent. I have not heard any headphone beat either of them in that regard, up to at least $1,000, maybe $2,000, and there are very, very few that meaningfully challenge them or better them, I should say, even beyond that. There are other headphones out there that have excellent mid-range and excellent mid-range timbre. Hi-Fiman Susvara, for example. That's a 6,000 MSRP, 6,000 US dollar MSRP headphone. But these two do that magnificent mid-range with vocals and instruments in that range just in a way that is very, very hard to replicate. And so that is the main reason why they have stuck around and why they are still worth your attention. You're going to find better bass, you're going to find better treble from other headphones, other models. You're going to find better spatial presentation. So they are, in many ways, one-trick ponies. But they do that one trick really, really well. Okay? And so, yeah, because of that, they have stood the test of time. All right, I'll go ahead and wrap it up there. So those are some of my thoughts on just the general Sennheiser line, at least in terms of the models I have heard, and then a more in-depth comparison of the HD600 and the HD650/6XX. So yeah, I will let your tastes and your wallet decide which way you want to go with those. So as always, thanks for watching. I am Wave Theory. Enjoy the music.